Well, good morning, everyone. I am
Morning.
Kim Johnson, and I am our tech host this morning. I am from Kirkwood, UCC here in Atlanta, and I also use the she, her pronouns, and I welcome everyone. And we are so glad to be together this morning and glad you could join us, and hope that annual meeting is going well for you so far this weekend. This morning, we are here with Tom, and I am going to read just a short introduction that Heather has shared with me. Um, Reverend Tom Query is a cisgender pastoral counselor and founder of the Wellspring Counseling Center in Decatur, Georgia. The folks at Wellspring are a collective of highly skilled and talented professional counselors, change makers, and transition experts who specialize in positive and accepting attitudes towards gender and sexuality. Tom and I will turn it over to you now. If anyone has any tech needs, please let me know. Just send me a message or pop it in the chat. We're glad you're here this morning. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Kim. Yeah, my name is Tom Query. My pronouns are he, him, his, and we are delighted you're with us this morning. We've got several presenters that'll be working with us, and our topic, in short, we're going to call the myth of binary. And we kind of want to present several ideas that we hope will be helpful for churches as you start working with or are working with people who are non-binary, transgender, anywhere across the spectrum that we'll be talking about this day. I wanted to just open first with a scripture and a quick prayer, and then we'll move right on into our presentation. Scripture is from Matthew 19:12. It says, "For there are eunuchs who were born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept this." Our God, be with us today as we try to learn new ways of thinking about your creation and about how you've created each of us. Be with us during this time. In all the great names we pray. Amen. We wanted to start with some basic definitions and vocabulary because let me get my PowerPoint up here and that'll help. That way I can concentrate. Some definitions that you may need to know. Now, this is going to be a screen full of names, and I want to just run through some of them, and I'd be glad to pass out the definitions for each of these to you. A lot of people, when they first start thinking about gender, and they're just overwhelmed by the LGBTQAI double square and all that kind of stuff, which changes almost monthly. But we wanted to have a few that come up that might be helpful. An ally is what I hope to be as a person who confronts heterosexism, sexism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and heterosexual privilege in themselves and others, because I care and love for all the LGBTQAI people. Asexuality, we're not going to cover much today, but it is generally characterized by not feeling sexual attraction for another person. One other important thing I want us to know going into this is that sexuality and gender are actually two different animals, where they seem to be the same, but they're very different. So some of these terms will be about sexuality, some will be about gender. This is about asexuality, or ACEs, they sometimes are called. Biphobia, a fear or hatred of people who are bisexual, pansexual, or omnisexual. Most of you know what coming out is. Cisgender is the prefix that means on this side of or not across. I call myself a cisgender male, term that can be called the attention to the privilege of people who are not cisgender. Crossdresser is something that's not used as much in our world as much anymore, but I wanted to put it in here because we want to make some distinctions with all of that. It's a person who dresses at least partially as a member of their other than their assigned sex, and it carries no implication for any kind of sexual orientation. Drag kings and queens are persons whose sex assigned at birth was either male or female and is dressing as the opposite for performance and doesn't always identify as their assigned gender at first. It has no implications at all about gender identity. It's another thing altogether. Gay, sexual orientation towards people of the same gender. Gender is this concept we're going to try to sit with today, which is a social construct that's used to classify people as man, woman, or some other identity. Most of us grew up in churches where there was only two. You were born male or female, and that was it. Gender can be fundamentally different than the sex one's assigned at birth. And there is a set of traits, social, psychological, emotional, and often social implications and expectations around that. Gender expression is about how you express oneself in terms of dress, mannerisms, and behaviors that society calls masculine or feminine. We'll hear today about queer or genderqueer folks whose gender identity or whose gender expression falls outside the dominant social norm for their assigned sex. And you are probably going to be hearing more and more of folks that talk about that. Heterosexism, assumption that all people should be heterosexual. It's rampant in our larger culture at present. It excludes the needs and concerns and life experiences of lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, transgender folks, while it gives advantages to heterosexual people. Some of what we're hoping our presentation will do today is confront that a bit. Heterosexuality, orientation, sexual orientation, in which a person feels emotionally and physically attracted to people other than their own assigned birth sex. Homophobia, fear of a lot of LGBTQAI folks. Homosexuality and homosexual is an outdated term to describe a sexual orientation in which a person feels physically and emotionally attracted to people of the same gender. Internalized homophobia is real in our world, and it's the fear or self-hate of one's own identity that may be in the LGBTQAI world. Intersex, you're going to hear us talk a little bit about that today, and we are, for simplicity, there's going to be some talking of intersex and transgender. They are very different. Intersex are people who, without medical intervention, develop primary or secondary sex characteristics that don't fit neatly into society's definition of male or female. Many visibly intersex people are mutilated in infancy, sometimes at birth and early childhood, by doctors to make the sex characteristics conform to what society's idea of what normal body should look like. Intersex people are very common. Melissa will talk a little about that in her presentation, although society's denial of their existence has allowed very little room for these issues to come to light. Lesbian, person whose primary sexual orientation is towards people of the same gender. The LGBTQAI, I'm not going to spend a lot of that, but that is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, asexual, and intersex. That's how all those lay out for our purposes. Non-binary, you will also be hearing some about that today, and you'll be hearing more about it, I think, as years go on. A gender identity that embraces a full universe of expressions and ways of being that resonate with the individual. It may be active resistance to binary male or female gender expectations, or it could be an intentional creation of unbounded ideas of their self and the world. Queer, you're going to hear more and more of that, I think, in culture. It includes, but is not limited to, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and asexual people. The term has different meanings to different folks. Some find it offensive. I think you may have seen my name is Tom Query. So when I was born in the 1950s, that was used as a derogatory term for me all the time. It is not anymore. And some still find queer offensive, while others really embrace it as a way of encompassing the broader sense of history of the gay rights movement. Can also be used as an umbrella term like LGBTQAI. Sometimes folks just call themselves queer, as in the queer community. Sexual orientation, I'm going to just jump over that. Transgender, most often used as a umbrella term for some commonly held definitions. Someone whose gender, identity, or expression doesn't fit the social constructs of an assigned birth or gender, a gender outside of the man and female, male and female binary identity, or having no gender or multiple genders. I simply look at it as that the brain doesn't match the body, and that is some of where all that gets worked into. A couple of other terms that we don't use anymore, but just to make sure they're out here because a lot of medical texts talk about it. Transsexual, often a derogatory term now, which comes, unless a person personally uses this, the correct term is transgender. And transvestite is an outdated and problematic term due to its historical use as diagnostic and medical and mental health disorders. In many ways, cross-dresser has replaced transvestite, so I'd be glad to get these definitions to you. I know that was a lot real fast, fire hose wise, but we wanted to at least have some of those out. And then when we get to some discussion with each other, you may have some questions about all of that, and that'll be fine. I am going to turn this over to Melissa Dickinson, who is going to do a very short presentation with us. So I'll turn it over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Tom. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Melissa Dickinson, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm a nerd at heart. I'm the kind of person who reads peer-reviewed journal articles for fun. So I know that that makes me a little strange and different. So be prepared for a few nerdy jokes that I will personally find hilarious, and you're welcome to roll your eyes, no judgment. I'm also a counselor and psychotherapist at Wellspring Counseling, Coaching, and Transition Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and I've been working as a committed ally and support of the gender spectrum community for over a decade. I also need to tell you about a woman by the name of Rebecca Helm, who is a fellow biology, ecology, and evolution nerd at UNC Asheville as an adjunct professor. The reason I'm mentioning her is her wonderful Twitter rant ended up inspiring my talk today about the myth of binary gender. So you'll hear me reference some of her quotes along the way. Here's the beginning of her Twitter rant for fun. She posted on the Open Ocean Exploration site because she studies marine life. Friendly neighborhood biologist here. I see a lot of people are talking about biological sexes and gender right now. Lots of folks make biological sex seem really simple. Well, since it's so simple, let's find the biological roots, shall we? Let's talk about sex. And she did it in a way that I found utterly charming and ended up guiding me a bit today in how I'm going to express my own thoughts about the gender spectrum. We humans really like things to be simple, black and white, all or nothing, but most of life just isn't that way. And biological sex isn't simple like that, and it has never actually been binary. But let's pretend for just a minute that it was simple. So what would happen if we tried to play detective and find the biological roots of sex and gender? Before I go further into that, a quick but very important detour. Stay with me. First, let me say that while I'm going to use biology and science to make it clear that gender is complicated and binary gender is a myth, I also think it's super important to know that intersex and transgender are not the same and do not necessarily have any relationship with each other. Intersex is one word that you've heard Tom say this a little bit earlier to describe a variety of situations where a person is born with reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't neatly fit the box of male or female. Transgender is a person whose gender identity does not line up with their birth assigned sex. So why am I talking about this? If biological gender exists on a spectrum, it makes perfect sense that gender identities will exist on a spectrum too. Back to biology. You may remember your high school biology class. I know it's probably been a minute for some of you, so let me refresh your memory. Your teacher probably tried to talk to you about chromosomes. There's 46 of them in humans. They come in 23 pairs, and they probably told you something really simplistic like XX equals girl and XY equals guy. Y'all, I'm about to tell you they left out some stuff. Of all these chromosomes, we really only care about one, a very small single gene. It's called the SRY gene. I'm going to call it the sorry gene, which I find funny, and I'm not remotely sorry about it. 6 different combinations of these chromosomes and genes result in live births. Here's a quick slide to give a picture of that. If you're trying to make the conversation exclusively about XX and XY, you're simply leaving out a whole lot of humans. In fact, 1 to 2 out of every 100 people were born not male or female, therefore intersex. For context, for something to be considered rare in the medical research community, it has to occur at a frequency of 1 in 5,000 or less. So actually, intersex conditions are a really common experience and not considered rare at all. Back to biology stuff for a second. We all start out as female, all of us. In early development, if the sorry gene is present and it flips its switch on, it then turns on other masculine associated genes. But by default, neutral is female when we start out in the womb. One of my mentors, a guy by the name of Bill Staten, who is an American Baptist minister, but also known for starting the first 2 PhD programs on sexuality in the US, like to say in many of his talks and classes that nature appears to have intended to produce a female and something has to be added to make a male, which actually has a slightly weakened structure DNA wise. Thought that was just an interesting concept. I'm going to throw up this slide too. Bill also had this slide to show that what he believed indicated that males are not necessarily the stronger sex. I thought that was just fun and interesting. But back to the science for a minute. So if a sorry gene is there, that person is considered chromosomally and genetically male, but it's not that simple. Borrowing from Rebecca Helm for a minute, a Y chromosome with no sorry means physically you're female, chromosomally you're male, XY, and genetically you're female, no sorry. An X chromosome with a sorry means you're physically male, chromosomally female, XX, and genetically male, sorry. But biological sex is simple. There must be another answer. The genes associated with sex ultimately turn on hormones or messages in parts of the body, and there are cells that function as receivers of these messages all over the body. Well, a lot can get complicated here. I want you to think about the last time you tried to call your doctor's office for anything, to get a message to your doctor or nurse. Did the call go through? Did you have to leave a message? Did anyone get your message? Did they get part or all of your message? Did they respond to your message if they got it? Did they respond to part? Did they get your message at all? Sometimes there are issues with sending, receiving, and interpreting messages in whole or in part. That happens with hormones and cells too. hormones also exist on a spectrum, and all human beings have both testosterone and estrogen in their bodies in different mixtures. For those of you who are also kind of science people, you know it's a little bit more complicated than that, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to keep it simple. Borrowing from Rebecca Helm again, if you're developing, your body may not produce enough hormones for your genetic sex, leading you to be genetically male or female, chromosomally male or female, hormonally non-binary, and physically non-binary. But cells have something to say about this. Maybe cells are the answer to biological sex, right? Cells have receptors that hear the signal from sex hormones, but sometimes these receptors don't work, like a mobile phone that's on Do Not Disturb. Call, and they will not answer. What does this all mean? In her words, it means you may be genetically male or female, chromosomally male or female, hormonally male, female, non-binary, with cells that may or may not hear the male, female, non-binary call, and all this leading to a physical body that can be male, non-binary, or female. Let me say this another way. Your genes can be gendered male, female, non-binary. Your hormones can lean female, male, non-binary. Your cells may or may not get the same or a different non-binary male, female messages from each other around the body, leading to internal genitalia that is male, female, or non-binary, with external genitalia that is female, male, non-binary, and brain structures that are non-binary male and female. None of these things have to be on the same page or agree with each other in the human physical body or gender experience. Try out some of these combinations for yourself. Notice how confusing it gets. Can you point to what the absolute cause of biological sex is? Is this any way to measure people? Wait a second. We forgot to talk about the brain dimorphism I just mentioned. In the 1990s, scientists began to compare sexually dimorphic regions in the brain of transgender people and the rest of humanity. I'm editing this verbally since the term used in this slide is now considered offensive. The results show that when individuals of sex A, despite having the chromosomes, gonads, and sex hormones of that sex, insist they're really sex B, the gender-affected parts of the brain typically more closely resemble what's usually seen with sex B. I'm going to show you this in a picture. Looking at these slides, slide A represents someone who identifies as a heterosexual man. Slide B is someone who identifies as a heterosexual woman. Slide C is someone who identifies as a homosexual man. I want you to notice how similar that is to slide A. Very, very subtle differences, but incredibly similar. Slide D is someone who identifies as a male to female transgender person. As you can see, slide D and slide B are far more similar to each other than slide D is to A or C, indicating what we've always known, that people actually do know who they are if we will listen to them. And I want to mention in this particular study, it may be interesting for you to know that hormones were not offered as treatment to any of these individuals. So this was actually the brains they came into adulthood with without hormonal intervention. I have a theory about gender I want to talk with you about. But it means we have to go back to statistics for a minute. It's really okay if you never had a stats class. I'm going to break this down and make it really simple. But for those of you who did, you may remember the bell curve. The bell curve is basically this mathematical magic that happens when you measure a large enough sample of humans on pretty much anything like income or IQ or height. If you get a big enough group, it'll fall out in this shape with these percentages. If you don't get this result, your sample size is likely just too small. As you can see, we're just going to use height as an example here. The area in green, if you add those percentages up, it's a little over 68%. 68% of humans measured on any given thing cluster tightly around the middle. If you add the yellow in, which is one standard deviation more for people who know a little bit about stats, 95% or a little over are represented under the curve. I want you to look at the edges. The red part, that's less than 2.5% on either end. I want to call that the binary section, the poles, the edges. As you can see, there's not a lot of humans there. Melissa's theory, if we get a large enough sample on gender, they're not just male and female, that binary thinking. I think it would shake out this way without our cultural biases. If we had access to all the internal information, our biases make us think that we are farther apart than we really are, more different than we are similar. And every measure we use tells us that that's not really the truth. Thanks for hanging out with Melissa's theory for a minute. Now, you have your own experience of gender. How much data do you have on your own biological sex? With all these possible differences existing in the same body, are you sure that your gender identity and biological sex match? Are you sure your biological sex lines up perfectly on all of the various dimensions we just talked about? Do you think you're in the middle somewhere or at the poles? Would you even want to know? Humans do not all line up perfectly in one body, one denomination, one cause, or one world. We are all on a spectrum, part of the beautiful rainbow. So let's let people tell us who they are. They know the truth at their core. Our job is to affirm people as they live the truth at every level. Thank you for letting me affirm the reality of the gender spectrum in my own nerdy way. Back to Tom.
Thank you, Melissa. You probably have some questions or things. We'll hold on to those for just a little bit. She threw a lot at us. And I hope you could hear, if you've never been exposed to these concepts, that it is a much more complex world we live in, including inside of our churches. And we really need to adjust our thinking and our ways of doing to this kind of reality. It's fine, and it's really up. We can dialogue on this, we can talk about this, but there's some things here we need to face, and that's what that's about. What we're going to do, we took about 25, 30 minutes to kind of do this initial kind of data stuff, and we're going to turn it more into some discussion and dialogue as we move along. I first want to introduce to you Dan Wilson, who comes to us from Marietta. And I have invited Dan and Reverend Kimball to be with us today. And we're going to talk with them, and we'll do some talking all together a little bit later. Let me turn it over to you, Dan.
Hey, so I wanted to just talk a little bit about my story. My name is Dan Wilson. I'm non-binary. I use they, them pronouns. And when I tell people that, for me, my sexual orientation, my gender identity, and my faith are all kind of wrapped up together. And today I'm gonna talk more about the gender identity portion, but you can't tell the story of one without the other, for me, and that surprises people. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I first wanted to say that I was not brought up in the UCC. I was born here in Georgia, and I went to a Southern Baptist church. And I grew up that way, and I grew up going to a fairly conservative private Christian school. And those institutions had a lot to say about my gender and who I was, and who they expected me to be, which was a straight masculine man is kind of the expectation. And that showed up in various ways. It wasn't always, you know, direct preaching or anything like that. You know, it was simple things like we had a church play that was, I forget really what the plot of it was, but for some reason we were all in like a university or something, and there were cheerleaders, and I wanted to be a cheerleader. I wasn't allowed to do that. At school, we had a choir show that we were putting together, and I tried out for the female solo. Wasn't allowed to do that. And so that was very much when I came to my home church, Pilgrimage UCC in Marietta. That's kind of the lens with which I viewed myself. And you know, it's funny. I actually picked Pilgrimage because I was looking to go to a church again. I hadn't been to church in several years. And my wife is actually bisexual. And so I knew if I was going to go to a church, I wanted it to be somewhere where she was affirmed. And I found this church. It's like 20 minutes away in my home city, and I gave it a shot. And what I wasn't expecting to happen was that Pilgrimage actually unraveled a lot of the views about myself that I had internalized from my upbringing and from the other faith-based places that I had been. And it allowed me to access things about myself that I had walled off and erased and pushed away because it was deemed unacceptable. I needed to know that no matter who I was, that God had a place for me. And I needed to know that no matter who I was, I had a place in the church, and that I could bring my whole self to a faith community. And that's what Pilgrimage offered me. After I came out as non-binary, I started wearing dresses to church, and not only was it not a problem, but I was complimented and encouraged and loved. And, you know, it seems small, but, you know, they have a gender neutral restroom. I didn't have to worry about that while I was there. A lot of places, you know, I'll leave early because I don't want to figure out which restroom is going to be safest for me. And, you know, after I came out, I was able to read scripture in front of the church. I was able to be on committees and fully participate in church life however I felt like. And because of this experience, I was able to grow in my faith practice and grow in my understanding of myself. And so that's what I mean when I say that my faith and my gender and my sexual orientation are all together. I couldn't have come out if I hadn't have gone to Pilgrimage. I couldn't have lived my authentic truth if I hadn't have gone to Pilgrimage, because it unraveled a lot of the faith-based things that I had internalized about myself. So yeah, I just wanted to tell that story and explain that.
Thank you, Dan. It's interesting. I asked Shar about this. There's a term called O&A, open and affirming. And about half of our churches in the conference are open and affirming. There's a couple that are trying to become that right now. But the whole purpose of that is to say, can we make our places open for somebody like Dan to feel truly affirmed as they come into the church? And so I thought that was a piece you might want to know. I'm going to introduce to my good friend, Reverend Sorrells. Kimball is here, and let you take it off for a while, and then we'll come back around and kind of have a panel discussion about some stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Kimball. They, them pronouns, he, him when I'm feeling butch. At some point we'll maybe talk a little bit about how some people have flexibility in their pronouns and others do not. So it's a good thing to ask. But I'll put a pin in that for later. So yeah, I would say I have a fair amount of overlap with my journey with Dan. I came out of the evangelical world and Southern Baptist. I would say I think the evangelical world that I was a part of made the Southern Baptists seem like liberals. So I was did the ex-gay thing. And I sometimes joke like it didn't work, or did it just turn me into a straight man? But I don't know. I don't really identify as a straight man, but it's kind of fun to joke that they prayed me into a heterosexual man. I don't identify that way. I actually identify as genderqueer or non-binary, but I would say I am transmasculine in nature. Anyway, I digress. So I grew up in that world, and then went to college, and actually Berry College, and so actually academia was sort of my coming out point, because I was able to examine and think critically about things like the Bible and how we interpret scripture and those types of things. So I was able to sort of reclaim Christianity from a much more thoughtful place, I would say. I left the evangelical world at the end of college, and sort of came back into the church actually via the Episcopal Church. So they still have a very sweet spot in my heart as well. That sort of the place that healed a lot of church wounds, was a place that kind of looks very institutional, actually, a lot of hierarchy, as one would think. And I if you know me, I love the smells and bells. So so that has stuck with me, even though I am very deeply UCC. Came to Atlanta after college and have been a member of Central Congregational ever since. And I think there I was able to really ask hard questions. It has nothing to do with gender and sexuality, but I was, working in a homeless shelter and dealing with the suffering that I was seeing in the world, and finding a faith that was able to wrestle with that, which is, I think, how I ended up being, very at home in the UCC, was being in a place that looks at those questions and wrestles and asks hard questions and has more questions than answers. Central has been a wonderful place for me. I think I would say that I kind of grew up there. I think we may have some Central members on here. So I was kind of a baby, I think, when I got there, and was there through seminary. I started to I came out as queer in college, or actually I think as gay. I would have said then. I didn't really know queer. And really in seminary that I started to identify as genderqueer or non-binary. And Candler, which is our artist school, was a very safe space for me to explore that. I had amazing friends, wonderful spiritual mentors that walked with me through that. So the church was very affirming for me in that part of my journey. I will say, I think this is worth mentioning, that I think as a clergy person going through the ordination process in a time that non-binary was not on most people's radars, that didn't go well for me. So I want to name that as a tension, that I think that sometimes we put spiritual leaders into this kind of, you have to have everything figured out sort of thing, or that we don't always understand things. And so we sort of put spiritual leaders through some interesting hoops. So I would say a little bit of my journey and my gender journey, I kind of squashed it a little bit as I was in the ordination process. so I want to name that and say, I think that the UCC is amazing, and the Southeast Conference has been amazing for me, and also has had some growing edges along the way. And I also want to honor that I've seen a lot of growth in that over the years since becoming ordained. I think I am the first ordained trans minister that we have in this conference. I know we've had a licensed minister, and I think I'm the first non-binary one, but I'm not positive about that. I'd have to ask somebody who's a historian. But you know, like, that was challenging to be the one that's trying to explain non-binary to people. But all in all, church has, when I found an affirming place, not the evangelical church, has been something that has been a place of great healing for me. And the one thing I want to share as sort of a story that's powerful is, I remember, I want to compare to, well, I want to share a story, which is to say, I remember the first time someone prayed for me, and they prayed with they, them pronouns. And no one had ever done that before. And it actually kind of caught me off guard that I felt seen and held in prayer for the first time. And so I elevate that to say, like, we're talking about these things and it may seem like complicated, or, you know, like, oh my gosh, this is a lot, or you don't have to understand all the biology. You just have to love, and it's not that hard. So I think I'll pause there. I could talk a while, you know, hashtag preacher problems, but yeah.
Well, I hope you will. I thank both of you for sharing some of your personal stories, and I'm hoping it is causing you to think about your own specific ministry locations. Our normal workshop for this talk is a day long, so we're trying to really do things in a very tight thing. And I wanted to share with you one more slide here, just so you have the data. This is on PBS. It is called a World Gender Map, Two Spirits Map. You literally can click on any country of the world, and it will tell you a bit of the genetic of the cultural response to gender, those kind of things. It's really quite fascinating. So I want you to be able to have that. It will blow your mind. Actually, the US is actually one of the worst in terms of how we treat gender in this world. So that can be one of the things we pass out to y'all. Let me open this up to two things. One is a kind of a panel discussion or questions from those of you who are with us. There is a thing at the bottom of your screen called chat. You can post your question there. You can raise your hand and just say you want to ask it. I will play Oprah Winfrey and just run up and down the aisles and put the mic in front of you. And Kimball was all excited about me doing that. So the couple of questions I have for Dan and Kimball and Melissa and I are experiences that have been both affirming and not affirming as you went through your journey of your spiritual life. You both shared some of that, and ways that spirituality and faith have been helpful. At the end, Kimball's going to do a piece about kind of suggestions for churches about what they can do specifically to help. So that's kind of the rest of our time. It is 1:45, and we have until 1:15. So we have about 30 minutes to talk, dialogue, have a discussion. Anybody have something? I'm glad Sarah is on the enterprise. She can make it so that's good. Yeah. Anybody, any one of us? Did you have a reaction to Melissa's talk, which I think is pretty earth-shattering if you really hear it? Or do you have any other kind of things? Here's a question. I hear how important it is to use people's pronouns correctly. Yes. And we've started adding pronoun buttons to their tags at church. How do you pronounce Z and Zim or other neo pronouns. Maybe Kimball, you can talk about that, about the other kind of pronouns that people use.
I can try. I think the most like statistically common non-binary pronoun is they. I think probably maybe the reason that is because it's a pronoun that we use have used for years and years and years. It's not new, so to speak. I have heard zim, which is the one that you mentioned, as also a pretty new one, a pretty frequent one. There are also people who I have known who have said, I don't want you to use pronouns, I just want you to use my name. I think those are the most common types of pronouns I have heard. I think the important thing to take away from that is that, people will tell you how they want you to speak about them, and to follow that. I think that it's one good way is if it's something that's name tags, those kinds of things, it can be helpful. Also, you can just listen to how someone speaks about themselves or how someone speaks about someone else. So I might say like, hey, this is my friend Dan. I know them because we did advocacy work together. And so now you've heard me use Dan's name and Dan's pronoun. So now you just pay attention. Listening, it's amazing what that'll do. And then it is okay to ask people politely. And a good way to model that is to say, hey, my name's Kim. I use they, them. What's your name and how would you like me to refer to you? Someone asked about, can you explain?
I was going to say from a cis point of view, the thing I run into most with folks that have not been exposed to gender is they just have a hard time getting their head wrapped around pronouns and using different pronouns. It makes the head hurt. And so I try to help people practice with that. I make mistakes occasionally. Melissa can tell you that. She either tells me quickly or I try to catch it. It is a practice thing. It is something, but the question that was given was, can you explain they, them, out of curiosity? Maybe I should be using them. I don't know. And I think whoever wants to answer that.
I can start, and Dan, you can take it away. The short version of they, them is we use it all the time without realizing that we're using it. The example I use is like someone cuts you off in traffic and you're like, look at this jerk, who do they think they are? Because you don't know what their gender is. So you use they, them in the singular all the time. And we've done it for years and years. Actually, it even goes back, even Shakespeare used it. So this idea, I think people sometimes can get up like, oh my gosh, it's grammatically incorrect because it's plural. It's not. First of all, it's not. It's been used this way for years. I would also say, even if it were grammatically incorrect, the laws of love always trump the laws of grammar. But I think Tom hits an important point, which is to practice. So one of the things I tell people to do is when you're singing songs in the car, just change the pronouns. Try switching the pronoun from he or she, try switching it to they, because it makes you have to think about things differently in your brain. Beyond that, I would say they is typically used by people who identify as either non-binary or agender. A lot of people who identify as, a gender that is not male or female will often use they, them. Dan, do you want to jump in here and add in?
Yeah, I think you about covered a lot of it, but yeah, I would say just kind of bouncing off of Tom's commentary about different pronouns and all that. Yeah, practicing is the way to do it. Even as a transgender non-binary person, I struggle with remembering people's pronouns sometimes. A problem that I have is I end up calling everyone they because I have so many non-binary friends. And then I'm like, well, wait, that's not quite right. And yeah, you just have to, when you catch yourself using a incorrect pronoun, try, just saying random sentences about that person with the correct pronouns, and just do it a couple times and move, internally move on, and if you do make a mistake, like um, to them, just correct yourself. It's not, as someone who gets misgendered a lot, it's not world ending. I just would love for people to just correct themselves and move on. I don't need like a 20-minute apology. It's fine. Just correct yourself and move on. That's all.
One of my tricks is somebody will come in and I do not remember what they told me their pronouns are. And I'm going, "Arr!" And so I will use they until I can get an idea again. They'll usually tell me, but I'll use they as a safety mechanism so that I'm not making an error with that. Somebody else made a comment, it's a really good one. How do we do this from the pulpit or from liturgy? It's a real problem. And one of the things I do is, particularly when I write a sermon, I run a check on mine for all the he, his words. And if I can possibly change that to something that is more broad or opening, there is a Bible called the Inclusive Bible. It can blow your mind some if you've ever read it through that perspective. And we are so accustomed to saying brothers and sisters, our Father, this, that, and the other. It is so natural to just use that because of however you learned it. It is a real exercise to try to say all God's people are included in this message. And so there may be some of the rest of you that have talked about how you change your liturgies and sermons to make things work in church. Anybody?
I actually had this on my best practices thing for later, so we'll just jump right into it. I always tell churches avoid using binary language when you're referring to your congregation. So there's a few ways that this comes up. Brothers and sisters is a big one. You can either use things like friends, beloved. I sometimes intentionally say brothers and sisters and siblings because it makes a point of noticing non-binary. So I sometimes say that when I'm praying, brothers and sisters and siblings. I will use they, them for God. Another one that comes up is splitting hymns or liturgy, where it's like, okay, men say this, women say that. Stop it. Just stop that altogether. A good way to change that, I understand like musically it can sound nice. So you can say high voices, low voices, because also there are cisgender women who are tenors. I was a tenor before I ever transitioned. So even as like in Baptist church choir, I was like, I don't know where to fit. So just find other ways of doing it. Siblings, beloveds, those types of things I think are great ways to avoid binary language in worship. The New Century Hymnal is decent about this. It could probably be updated. Getting hymnals updated in the church takes a while. So, but I would say, yeah, avoid those things. Find creative ways to speak about people in worship.
Tricia made a beautiful comment saying that sounds like grace is a good thing to remember for ourselves and for others as we all learn how to do this. Beautiful. Thank you for saying that. Melissa, somebody said, say a little bit more about science. I'm going to add in what they didn't say. Please tell me they're starting to teach this in high school. That's not what she said, but.
Oh, I wish they were. I remember even in my undergraduate biology courses, it wasn't really well covered. Because I'm a science nerd, I'm also a chronic illness person and identify as part of the disability community. I spent a lot of time reviewing peer-reviewed literature, so I dug into this a long time ago very deeply, and it's not hard to find in professional journal articles. It's very hard to find, even with basic Googling, in terms of trying to get any clarity on gender, because the first thing that comes up is like a binary, that kind of a binary point of view Wikipedia article that is wildly inaccurate. So I think that not having this taught to humans as a whole, or not having this taught in schools with any degree of accuracy, does play a role in feeding the bias in our culture. And as some of the people on our team pointed out earlier, this is, we are kind of known as one of the worst developed nations for our attitudes around these issues and how we talk about it in culture, even in our scientific and academic institutions. So we have a lot of room to grow.
It was a few years ago where Target changed, I think it was Target, changed their toy section to not be blue and pink, and people lost their minds. But they've done a really good job of that. In some businesses, you can tell when they're attempting to do this differently. Somebody also asked a question about, is the asexual category new? Not to people who are asexual. It's probably new to most of us who haven't heard that term. It's a very new one, and to public, to kind of, and asexual is called ace. You can also be a gray ace and some other kind of things. I was talking to somebody yesterday who was a gray ace, and I asked them the question about that with themselves, and they were going, it was very difficult for them to say, I do not operate off of having sexual feelings about another person. And my relationships with people are so radically different with folks because of that. So no, it's not new, but it's probably new to you and to a lot of people maybe hearing it for the first time. How do we handle gender-specific pronouns in the scriptures? I'm a retired biologist, pastor, African-American, that grew up Methodist and attended the University of Georgia with a strong Baptist history, now pastoring a UCC church. God help you, brother. So when I do this, I often say, I'm going to read from the TQV, the Tom Query version. And what I do is I go through and try to do my best at making gender-specific pronouns. It is quite an exercise to do, but it's doable, and that's where the Bible that is gender neutral is very helpful. But I go through every prayer, every Bible reading, every responsive reading, and I try my best to make those changes prior. Most people seem to not react to it. Sometimes people will come up and say, where do you get the TQV? And I'm going, no, you can't. But it is my attempt to do the gender-specific pronouns from the pulpit. Anybody else have a suggestion around that?
I have general thoughts on that. And I'm not sure exactly which particular, sorry, toddlers are outside my door. Not exactly sure which passages you have in mind in particular. I think one of the things that I love about the UCC, and I think theologically is important in this conversation, is that we embrace a lot of mystery generally. And so when we talk about embracing the mystery of God and recognizing that not even talking about gender, but that God is beyond our ability to articulate in words. When we start to examine those mysteries of our faith, I think that really allows us to open the mysteries of gender a lot more. There's a beautiful children's book that just came out by Rachel Held Evans and Matthew Paul Turner called What is God Like? And it's very much that. And I think if we start teaching kids and ourselves to look at things that aren't always clear in black and white, I think that's going to equip them to just deal with the complexities of the world better, but also gender. I think, like I said, my biggest challenge to my faith was not my gender identity. It was dealing with the stuff that I saw when I was working in a homeless shelter. That was the biggest challenge to my faith, because there was so much pain. And so I think if we start to learn to critically interpret scripture in a way that embraces these questions and mystery, that's just going to set us up to deal with these questions a lot more. If you're thinking, this may going back to the original question, if you're thinking about things like, I just think about like the Proverbs 31 woman was like something that was hammered into us as like a Baptist. I think like some of those ideas of like biblical womanhood and manhood, I think it just goes back to, kind of critical scripture analysis. But looking at like what's the teaching behind this that's not necessarily about gender, like wisdom literature teaches us something about wisdom. So like maybe the Proverbs 31 woman isn't necessarily about a gender role, but it's just about a disposition of wisdom. So like how do we look at those scriptures that maybe are more gendered in a way that isn't necessarily about gender roles? I'm not sure if that answers your question or not. And there's, like Tom maybe pointed out, there's a lot of gender ambiguity in scripture. We could just spend a whole day on like, okay, here's one that I love. Sorry, I'm going into nerd mode now. So Genesis 1 is the one that a lot of times is like, well, God created male and female, and so therefore binary. But what's really important to note about that is that God created male and female in God's image, which means that God is both encompassing of male and female and everything in between and beyond. And so I tell people that God is genderqueer. Now, I somewhat am joking about that, but I think it's important to remember that the divine is beyond gender. And so trans people, I think, are a gift to the church in that we allow people to see aspects of the divine that binary people do not. And there's a rabbi, a trans rabbi that talks about this and talks about how the teachers of the Talmud and the Mishnah, we're looking at these places like dawn and dusk that could be seen as sort of threatening, right? They're outside of the binary, but they saw these as the most holy times to pray. These are these thin spaces, these liminal spaces that are kind of gray. So I'll turn off my nerd mode and stop, but
all good, Kimball. The other comment I wanted to make that I think would be interesting is I'm an old dude, and I grew up with everything binary. Everything was binary, right, wrong, male, female, races, genders, everything was binary. And we think that way. The younger generations are not thinking binary. They're not being taught the same, and they are more open to seeing things in terms of the way we're talking about it today. My comment to the church, and then we'll turn it back over to Kimball again to talk about some best practices. But I think we're running folks off by not challenging these ideas, by not looking at this through this lens. I think Melissa makes a hard argument that most of us are on a spectrum. And if we start acknowledging that, it's going to open up a lot of opportunities in the church. Last thing, and then I'll turn it over to Kimball. Somebody said that Charis Books has really good books that embrace the gender spectrum. And the last question, Catherine, is a good one. The difference between gender and sexuality. I'm telling you, that's what blows people's minds all the time. So you can be trans male attracted to to men, and that doesn't make you gay. So sexuality is one animal that is separate, completely separate from gender. So gender can be all across these spectrums we're talking about, and then who you are sexually, how you're wired that way, is two different discussions. I didn't do that well enough. Anybody got something fast better than that?
I was just going to put it this way. Think of like gender being on one spectrum, sexuality being on another spectrum. And the only way that they overlap is in terms of how we talk about it in language, and every language and every culture has a different way. of expressing those intersections, but they're two separate things. So you can identify anywhere on the gender spectrum, anywhere on the sexual spectrum, and be fully authentic and accurate to your own experience.
Okay, let me turn it over to Kimball to kind of wrap us up with best practices.
Sure. So I have a few things to talk about with churches, and we've hit on some of these. I think we've said a little bit about respecting pronouns is one of the biggest things that churches can do. Some great ways to do that. I think Pilgrimage, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, has like a table, or you can get, it's either pronoun pins or you just put them on your name tag.
Yeah.
Name tags are great for so many reasons. I have forgotten my best friend's name in the middle of communion, so name tags are amazing. Putting your pronouns on your name tag, simple, easy way to fix that. Train your ushers, greeters, people in leadership, that when they greet people at the door, to not assume their pronouns. Those are really basic ways that you can do a lot with pronouns. Dan already mentioned this, but making sure that you have some sort of all gender restroom. A lot of times this is like a single stall, wheelchair accessible restroom. Those are great ones to make all gender. A lot of times buildings have them anyway, they just haven't been like designated. But make sure that they are wheelchair accessible, and that they're easy to find. That like you don't have to go down through the church basement, around the corner to the janitor's office. Again, making sure greeters know where to tell people restrooms are. So restrooms are a big one. Avoiding binary language in worship. We've already talked about that, so I won't talk too much about that. Hold training and information sessions for members. What we have touched on here is barely scratching the surface. I would encourage all churches to do a deep dive in this. Invite trans people to share their experiences for you. And also, let's be clear, you should pay people for their labor. Trans people should not have to come and do labor for you for free. Pay them. There are lots of people doing these kinds of trainings. Observe or notice things that are significant to the trans community. So noticing the Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is November 20th every year. It's a day that we mark those who have been killed by anti-trans violence in the last year. Trans people are killed more than LGBT people, and in particular, trans women and trans women of color are overwhelmingly the victims of violence. So you don't want to necessarily lead that, but noticing it, marking it in your prayers, things like that. Paying attention to Pride Sunday, those types of things. Advocate in the community, being involved in political action. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. You can also, if you have trans members in your congregation, you can use ritual as a way of affirming different aspects of their journey, if they would like that. Some people don't want to stand up in front of the church for whatever reason. But if someone's going through their gender transition and they have chosen their new name and you want to have a naming blessing, that's a great way to affirm trans people. You might incorporate like a reaffirmation of baptism in that. There's a lot of ways to do that. Praying for people when they are at different places in their journey, supporting, meal trains after surgery is a great thing, which I will also say leads to the question of come from a place of concern, not curiosity. So oftentimes people are very invasive to trans people in terms of asking inappropriate questions. A great question is, how are you doing? Or how is your, if you know someone's in their gender transition, how are things going for you? How are you feeling? Open-ended questions that allow them to speak about what it is that they want to share with you, as opposed to saying like, hey, have you had the surgery? That's an invasive question. That's about you. That's not about them. Also, there is no one surgery, so just avoid that question altogether. I'll come back to that. But coming from a place of concern rather than curiosity. Have trans members in leadership. It says a lot when I walk into a church and I see someone like me. That just is what it is. Make explicit in your welcome statements that you welcome LGBT people and make sure to include trans. A lot of churches that are very gay churches even aren't necessarily the most affirming for trans people. So make sure that that's explicit. You can put a rainbow flag and a trans flag right there on the website. It's an easy way to make it known. And related to that, I would say, become an ONA congregation. A lot of time when I was first looking for affirming churches, I just did a search for ONA or, you know, whatever types of things in whatever denomination it was. And if they weren't ONA, I wasn't going. They may have been as affirming as they could be, and I just didn't know it, but I wasn't going. I wasn't going to step in the door. I wasn't going to risk it. So make that explicit. And if you are an ONA congregation and you have been for a while, I would say it might be time to re-examine your ONA covenant and see if you are up to date on best practices and trans inclusion. That's the big things that I have for churches, and I know we're sort of out of time. But if others, Dan, if you have other things you want to chime in here on churches or general ally tips, I have, but I don't want to talk the whole time.
I mean, I think you covered most of it. I don't even know that I can think of anything to add. I will say the whole renewing of the baptismal vows. Well, it wasn't done explicitly because I came out after I had come out to a few people. There just happened to be that we were doing that at church, and after coming out, that felt really great. So I can imagine.
You made a mention, Kimball, of the flag, the LGBT and the trans flag. Just for factoid information, the trans flag was created by a member of the Pilgrimage Church. The original trans flag is ours. I'll just include Monica and say it's ours. And so that flag that is used all around the world came out of Marietta, Georgia. And I just think that's beautiful. Well, folks, I hope this has been helpful to y'all. It is a beginning of a discussion. Wasn't meant to be the end all. I really hope, and I'm so thankful to Shar and Heather for making this happen. And I just am delighted that all of you came. And thank you so much for being interested in all God's people. So thank you very much.
Everyone.